Claire. Today we are starting our Unit 8 lectures. This is really going to be the last unit we go into depth for. Unit 9 is essentially just human geography, which is a class all of you have already taken. So we are just going to really look at the rest of the 20th century, decolonization and the Cold War. And today we are going to really start by thinking about independence movements. So I would like you to think about how have colonies achieved independence historically. We've talked about different groups of people over the course of this class and how they have been conquered and become independent. I want you to think back, what does that process look like? Today, in particular, we are going to be talking about Indian independence, and we are also going to look a little bit at what's been going on in Latin America. So our objective is out of topics 8.5, 8.6, and 8.7 dealing with decolonization. So I want you to be able to compare the processes by which various peoples pursued independence after 1900. And we are going to start. We're going to start by talking about India and then Latin America as well. So, the Indian independence movement. Let's think back about the context for what we're talking about here. India had been ruled by the British for several centuries by this point. If you remember, they had first been ruled by the British East India Company, and then they were ruled by the British Crown, the British Raj, after the Sepoy Rebellion, when it became clear that having a corporation rule an entire subcontinent may not be the best idea. So let's think a little bit about infrastructure under British rule. Well, we know that in their various colonies, the British often built up infrastructure, but in a way that was designed to help their own economic exploitation of the country. So in particular, we'll see the building up of railroads, harbors, and some modern cities. But these are designed primarily to be an asset to the colonizers as opposed to the colonized peoples. So agriculture is the primary base of India. Most people are just subsistence agricultural workers, so they're just growing food to feed themselves. But we also see India is producing much of Britain's cotton. You have large steel mills as well. So the tricky thing about India is that it is very fertile, but very vulnerable to droughts. So you really have to rely on those monsoon winds. And the southern part of India is like tropical rainforest, but much of the northern part can be pretty arid. And remember, the India we are talking about here includes what we now consider to be Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. So between 1896 and 1900, you had 4 years without the seasonal rains, which will cause a famine that will kill 2 million people. But overall, the Indian population is increasing. So in the year 1900, you had 250 million people. By the year 1941, you had 389 million. So this is going to have increased pressure on the natural environment. We see increased deforestation and increased irrigation use because the rains no longer can meet your agricultural needs. We see that the land available for peasant farmers, though, is decreasing. And the economic development really didn't help the average Indian. So what's been going on with Indian society? Well, most people are pretty poor. They will pay rents to local landowners. They will have to get loans from the village money lenders to be able to buy seeds or technology to farm. And they would have to pay back those loans with interest. They have to pay taxes to the government. So this means at the end of the day, they really don't have any capital on hand, right? They don't have cash on hand that they can use to improve the quality of their land, to invest in their own business, or to improve the standard of living for their family. In cities, you have massive amounts of poverty. Even though you do have craftsmen and traders, it's still, most people are living pretty much hand to mouth. We see that India continues to be a very patriarchal society, and one that continues to undervalue women. So the British tried to combat practices like child marriage and sati, which is the ritual suicide of widows. And yet we know that often these top-down measures are not the most effective ways to increase the equality of women in a society. We see that this is an incredibly multilingual territory. You have literally thousands of languages being spoken. However, English is serving as the lingua franca. And then, of course, you have your two major religions. The Hindus, which are subdivided into hundreds of castes and subcastes. And each of these different subcastes, these different jati, are affiliated with a particular occupation. So you see that these groups of people are incredibly segregated. You have no intermarriage or social interaction between different castes, right? If you are a high caste of one and a low caste of the same one, so let's say you're a high caste Brahmin and someone else is a low caste Brahmin, it doesn't matter that you are both Brahmins. You would not interact with each other. You would not talk to each other. And you have no real interaction between Hindus and non-Hindus. So this is an incredibly stratified society and very segregated. The other majority religion in India at this time is going to be Islam, right? Muslims. This is about 25% of the total population. But we see that the majority of let me rephrase that. Although, if you're thinking about the entire territory of India, only 25% of the total population is Muslim. However, in the regions that we now know as Pakistan and Bangladesh, the majority religion of those particular regions was Islam. So you had, as we do now, more Hindus living on the Indian subcontinent and more Muslims living in the East and West. And many of these Muslims felt very discriminated against by the British and by their Hindu neighbors. So, British rule and Indian nationalism. Well, the Indians, we know, had been complicit in some ways, right? The Mughal princes had allowed the British to get a foothold in India because they were able to profit, right? Even though this was ultimately detrimental to the majority of Indians, a few select families were able to profit from this close partnership with the British. And yet not everyone was okay with British rule. So I think we've talked about this group before, but the Indian National Congress Party is going to be a political party that will lead India to independence and will ultimately govern India through its post-colonial era. It was formed in 1885 as an educated political club for men who had been educated in the West, right? So it was designed to just be sort of a club where these Indian men who had gone to Oxford and Cambridge, who had gotten their college and graduate school degrees in Europe, then come back to India and they get together and they talk about their ideas and their frustrations. It was initially supported by the British officials who saw it as an outlet for frustration. But what it is going to do is it will end up giving Indians a sense of a political identity within this vast system. You will also have the All-Muslim League, which is a similar political organization designed to defend the interests of India's Muslim minority. So, many things happen, and you are going to see a pattern emerge as the British continue to make decisions without actually consulting the Indians themselves. So over time, the National Congress Party, the NCP, will become concerned over the British Raj's blatant racism and their treatment of the budget, where most of the money will go to the British Army and administrators as opposed to Indian civil servants or India itself. The All-Muslim League will emerge after 1906 because in 1906, the British Viceroy, this is the guy who's in charge of all of India in Asia, right? Obviously Queen Victoria, or the British Crown was in charge of all of India. But in 1906, the British Viceroy will divide Bengal in two without actually consulting any of the people who live there. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah is going to be the founder of the All-Muslim League. And on average, we found that Indian Muslims were poorer than Hindus. And we see that, in fact, many lower caste Hindus convert to Islam to escape caste discrimination, right? That's one thing that Islam has in common with like Christianity. All people are equal before God, whereas in Hinduism, there is a hierarchy up to salvation. We will also see that the British will exacerbate this because they will give different types of representation and voting qualifications for Hindus and Muslims. So, the British and World War I and India. We will see that the Indians will contribute greatly to World War I as a colony of Great Britain. They are going to contribute textiles for uniforms, grain, and even soldiers themselves. The wartime inflation will impact India, and frankly, 1.2 million Indian men will volunteer for the army. So if you see the movie 1917, one of the characters who shows up in that, just briefly, because there's not a very large cast in that movie, is a Indian man. He's a Sikh. The British leaders promised Indians self-government once World War I was over. But of course, we know this didn't happen. We see that a few reform steps were put into place to try and appease some of these Indian interests and to make it look like the British were actually honoring their promises. So, for example, the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 provided Indians opportunities to vote for and serve on all Indian legislative councils on the local level. And Montagu Chelmsford reforms of 1919 will give Indian legislatures increased control over those councils, right? So headed towards self-governance on a local level. And yet the Rowlatt Act is going to really restrict Indian civil rights. It's a step backwards. So the Rowlatt Act of 1919 will restrict the freedom of the press. The idea is to root out conspirators as more and more Indians become dissatisfied and frankly disillusioned. World War I is going to have a psychological sort of reverberation through the colonized world as well, as the colonized peoples really realize that, hey, the British aren't better than us. Like, Europeans aren't somehow superior. They just invented the steam engine first. But look at how they killed each other. We can do a better job than what they are doing. So the Rowlatt Act will fuel local protests and will really cause many Indians to doubt British intentions. So the protests will lead to the Amritsar massacre, where a British general will order troops to open fire on 10,000 peaceful protesters. So just like our earlier movements of revolution, we will see that Indian liberal ideas will be influenced by Enlightenment concepts of natural rights, and the influence of European political and educational institutions will help many Indian men in particular have the knowledge of British systems and the vocabulary to really advocate for their own independence. And yet, Indian nationalism will be inspired predominantly by Indian cultural and political traditions. So, the movie Gandhi, starring Ben Kingsley as Gandhi, is a little controversial now because obviously Ben Kingsley is a British dude. And yet, he puts in an incredible performance, and it's a really, really excellent view of India during this time. So there's a clip from it which shows the Amritsar massacre, and it shows sort of the callousness of the British troops. I really recommend you watch it. I mean, you should watch the movie in general. But let's talk about Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was an interesting and hugely important figure. So his first name's actually Mohandas, and he will be the ultimate leader of Indian independence movements and an advocate for nonviolent resistance. He will really emerge as an Indian leader around 1919 with the Rowlatt Act. He is one of these Western-educated Indian men. He is born of a sort of middle-class family. His father is a civil servant in the government system. He will go to the UK and study law there. He will, in fact, live in South Africa and practice law for the Indian community there. So pause for a moment and think, why would there be Indians living in South Africa? Hopefully you are reminded of the different migration patterns that we've talked about in the end of the 19th century. How we saw people moving within the British imperial system, particularly Indians traveling to places like Africa and Australia and Suriname to work on massive farms and plantations. So, he is going to turn away from the West, though. You see pictures of a young Gandhi, and he's wearing British suits. He has the British style fashion and ways of speaking. In fact, you can look over time, his way of speaking will become less British and more Indian over time. So he will ditch Western style clothing and wear simple peasant garb. He will speak for the poor and illiterate, right? The National Congress Party was really speaking for upper class Indians, right? These were the families who had enough wealth to send their sons to Europe to be educated. Now, with Gandhi, we will see Indian nationalism will stop being an educated elite movement and start being a national one, a mass one that includes all classes of people. The fact of the matter is he is a brilliant political tactician and a master of public relations. So you look at him, and particularly in the West, we look at him and we think, oh my gosh, like he's so deep and so simple, like he's able to pull out these truths out of such chaos. Guys, he's a trained lawyer. He knows exactly what he's doing. He calls up the press before he's going to do one of his marches. He makes sure he has an audience, right? I mean, yes, he is able to articulate seemingly simple truths out of complex ideas, but he is not to be underestimated. So he will walk to the sea and make his own salt because the British government had a monopoly on the salt industry. And so if you wanted to use salt in your cooking, and I don't know if you've ever eaten something that didn't have any salt in it, you always want to use salt in your cooking, you had to pay the British government to buy salt. So what he's going to do is he's going to say, like, I refuse to pay the British government, so I'm going to walk to the ocean and make my own salt. Thousands of people will copy him, and unfortunately, violence will break out as well. He will fast almost to death to protest the violence by the police and his followers and to demand independence. So he will often use these fasts as a protest. He will be arrested repeatedly and will spend 6 years in jail and will really become a cult figure around the world, right? People will be fascinated by him. So here he is on the salt march, sort of walking to the ocean to make their own salt. So in the 1920s, slowly, the British will start to hand over some national areas, things like education, the economy, public works. They will admit more Indians into the civil service and officer corps. We see that Indian politicians will pass tariffs to protect British industry, allowing for increased industrialization. This will create a class of wealthy Indian businessmen who will support the Indian National Congress and independence. In 1942, the Quit India movement will emerge. It's going to be a massive example of civil disobedience designed to end the British control of India. Included in it will be demands for a separate Muslim state led by the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So the two main names that you should know for Indian independence is Ghandi and Jinnah. These are the two men, each representing Hinduism and Islam, these two major sort of voices for India. Unfortunately, we will see vicious Hindu, Muslim, and Muslim Sikh rioting before, during, and after partition. So like I said, the movie Ghandi is just really excellent. I really encourage you to watch it. Okay, so even Gandhi couldn't heal the rift between Hindus and Muslims. Muslims really felt left out of the Indian independence movement, like their input wasn't sought. When they tried to participate, that they weren't welcome. We see that in your first set of elections, the Indian National Congress Party will win, but they refuse to share power with the Muslim League. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah will be the man who ends up founding the state of Pakistan. He's also a trained lawyer, And he is going to always be advocating really for Muslim participation in politics. So he's trying to negotiate with the British and with the Indian National Congress Party for Muslim participation. From 1940 on, though, he's going to really be advocating for an independent Muslim state. Jawaharlal Nehru is going to be the man who really succeeds Gandhi as a leader. So it is going to be Nehru who really negotiates the end to British colonial rule, and he will become the first Prime Minister of India. So it's going to be Nehru and Jinnah who are going to be trying to negotiate, I apologize, guys, all of this information. And we are going to see that violence will ultimately break out. So, power will be handed over to the rulers or the leaders of the National Congress Party in India after 1945. Frankly, after World War II, the British were like, all these colonies, they're not worth the hassle. We're done. All right, you're going to see World War II really being a turning point. Also, Hitler went and conquered everyone, and the British and Europeans were like, wow, it really sucks being conquered and having people trying to conquer you. And then they sort of thought, oh, wait, that's what we did. Maybe that's not a good look. So we see that India will be led by Jawaharlal Nehru, who's really going to want to industrialize India. Pakistan will be created with Jinnah as the first president. But here's the problem with Pakistan. You have Eastern Pakistan and Western Pakistan. So Eastern Pakistan is what we now know as Bangladesh. And if you think, hey, that seems dumb, having your country split in half by a giant subcontinent, you're right. That's not going to work. Let's look at the map. So this is what was India, and now post-independence, you have Pakistan and Pakistan. Then you have like Burma and Sri Lanka, Ceylon, which are still going to be controlled by the British for a little bit longer. There's going to be massive migration between these regions as Muslims move out of India into Pakistan, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force, as their Hindu neighbors threaten to murder them if they don't leave to try and create a Hindu-only state. And the same thing, Hindus are forced to leave these regions that are now Pakistan in an effort to create an all-Muslim state. 12 million people will be forced to move. You see riots and massacres. People will flee their homes based on religions. Trainloads of desperate refugees will be attacked and massacred or left stranded in the desert. Over 500,000 people will die in all of this. So it's really important to understand this for understanding the modern day relationship between Pakistan and India. In the 1970s, we'll see Bangladesh become its own country. And in 1948, Gandhi will be assassinated. So, who was Gandhi and how did India achieve its independence? Pause and see if you can answer these. Oh, I'm sorry. Riots and massacres. Look at the map. You can really see the movement of peoples there. I like how it's Pakistan, India, Pakistan, India. It's very strangely designed. Okay. So, I want you to be able to compare and contrast Indian revolutions, the Indian independence movement, with other revolutions. Think about all the ones we've learned about in class. And there's a really good crash course on decolonization in general that looks specifically at India. But I want you to pause and be able to really discuss compare the processes by which various peoples in South Asia pursued independence after 1900, and identify and explain one challenge faced by India after independence. So use this as a self-assessment tool to see, okay, do I actually understand this content, or has it really just gone through one ear and out the other?